I also try to present some ideas about development in Russian to save time. Россия несколько раз за свою историю, во всяком случае, за прошедшее столетие, пыталась предложить
for the past century, Russia has tried to offer a new model for development and resolve some of the scourges like overcoming lagging behind of developing countries, underdeveloped countries, to overcome inequality, to create not only a new economy but a new society where all professions and social groups could fulfill themselves. And each time the breakthrough and the tremendous growth was followed by a downturn and collapse. In terms of per capita parameters, per capita consumption, by 1913 we had 30%, zero of the United States consumption. Then there was a collapse, and then there was another upsurge in the socialist period, socialist planning system, where by 70s and 80s we also had 30 to 40% of US consumption based on how you calculate the GDP of the Soviet Union. Then there was another downturn and collapse, and now in 2012 we have this again, this level, 30% of US GDP using purchasing power parity. At the same time, but we are a different social system relative to the Soviet times, and there's an essential difference and distinction from OECD requirements in terms of the educational, healthcare standards and science, although there's a handicap that we have relative to developing countries. Vladimir Popov, in his research, said Russia is special or abnormal developing countries, because by its parameters it's a developing country, but having missiles, ballet, the Academy of Sciences and space assets, it may be classified as a developed country. In that sense, the crisis of 2008 and 2009
может быть, новые модели развития, которые мы сейчас наблюдаем, она тоже, наверное, должна дать ответ на вопрос, либо мы станем из ненормальной развивающейся страной, как бы нормальной развивающейся страной, как Владимир Попов считает, то есть потеряем. Ну, балет, я надеюсь, нет, но в всяком случае, то, что связано с космосом, с наукой, здесь при сложившихся тенденциях действительно есть риск или угроза того, что мы скатимся в средние позиции и мало чем будем отличаться от других стран. Либо мы найдем все-таки свою модель дальнейшего развития, и более того, страны БРИКС вместе мало что объединяет, точнее, вообще трудно сказать, что их объединяет, кроме того, что возникла такая аббревиатура и некоторая...
This abbreviation and some sort of communication in the BRIC countries, they have something in common. They do not make a unified model, of course, but the approaches to the solution of the problems of development, they search for that very intently. And perhaps debates, discussions, and attempts to implement it will find the answers to these issues, which would be important not only for the BRICS countries, but also to the world at large. On some lessons of the crisis that are currently extracted and reflected on without any finding or final solution, we are facing still serious solutions. The first issue is the issue of rates of growth. Yes, we can develop. We can get quality development with low rates of growth, and modern economy is shifting instead of 4 to 5% annual growth. They come to the new range of 3 to 4%. And Russia is in a situation when our rates of growth, if we take the mid-forecast, are lower than the rates of growth of the world economy. We can either accept this, and a number of decisions depends on this acceptance, and many experts favor this, to play modestly, to do what we can in the budget regulations, in moderate demand for raw materials. These are the rates of growth, slightly higher than in Europe, but one stances do not aspire for the role of a leader of economic growth. It seems to me that the second option, the policy of dynamic growth, is facing us. In spite of the prices for gas and natural resources and oil, they would not be increasing, but the policy of economic development in such conditions has not been yet elaborated. Perhaps the possible scenario for the decision taken would be 3 or even less % growth for Russia GDP. The second issue is the financial priorities for banking sector, for the state at such, for the business quarters, entrepreneurial priorities of production. And one of the lessons of the crisis for the statement of US reindustrialization and new industrial policy in France, you can see that these statements are going to shift priorities from financial markets, from financial capital, from derivatives to the real development, to the real economic growth. But if you look at the Russian economy, we see here that the crisis of 2008-2009 shift the priorities into a different direction. If prior to 2008 the companies sacrificed their banking assets and saved the real production, now the redistribution, with the help of the state, is completed in favor of financial sector, and industrial segment is in much worse situation than it had been in prior to 2008. And this happens on both the level of corporations and on levels of state priorities at such, and level of industries. We have budgetary rules installed and accepted the policy of coming to deficit-free budget. Profit or deficit of the budgets is another issue. Maybe theoretically it's a neutral issue towards the economic growth, but the question where the budget is spent for, of course, this is relevant to modernization tasks. By rigidifying budgetary policies, we see the reduction of costs for health, research, and education, which is incompatible with ideology not only of growth, but also with ideology and policy of development. Our business is not willing to invest to private or public innovative projects. Modernization, education and health has never been resolved with major involvement of the state. Now, we spend only 4% of GDP on education. It's the level of India. By 2016, if you look at the budgetary remarks, we'll get lower than that figure, to 3.5%. This is incompatible with qualitative development of education, neither with pretense to get into world rank educational system, nor with the priorities of being innovative in research and development. So according to the demand of foreign companies and foreign centers on the brain drain on our students and experts from these top-level institutions, we see that there are shifts. The situation in budgetary costs for health, 3.4%, it is 2 times less in OECD countries and 4 times less than in the United States. If you want to have healthy nation, modern health system that would provide acceptable level of health control, these expenses should be considerably increased. This is not only a question of an increase per se, it is the question of social structure of the society. 20% of the middle class, of people who are below the middle class, but close to that, the teachers, scholars, health workers, If we exist in low budgetary costs, we can either have to get paid education, paid health, and that would lead us to 12, 14 million, one-fourth of all employed in Russia. They would be doomed for emigration, doomed for being squeezed out of the country, or at least at low level of living. The third aspect is the reindustrialization as such. We stated it as a priority, and we seem to draw the lessons out of crisis that we do not need only virtual and intellectual investments, but real investments in modernizing our economy and reinstitution of space industry, aircraft industry. But on the general, support of the industry is going to be reduced, not increased. And what is more important, we do not have any investment growth into transport infrastructure. Hence the problem of rails, ports, sea roads, and transport channels is very complicated. 2.5% of GDP is not enough for that, for the infrastructure. So we use the foundations of national welfare, withdraw the funds from foreign assets of Russian Federation, but these are only done on a marginal scale, and solution of the tasks that are required for Eurasian transit corridor and for the local transport system, amelioration for the transport infrastructure, are not being resolved. These resources are absolutely not enough to implement these tasks. I am sure that we have not extracted all the lessons from the previous crisis. I hope we would not need the second crisis, but in some time, perhaps even earlier than we wish, by 2018-2019, we will meet another crisis. But the question is not of cyclical fluctuations, but the question is about our consecutive policy of development. And presently, we have more questions than answers, and the answers, partial answers that we find, they do not enable us to resolve and find an attractive model for us and for our partners in CIS countries and for our own society. Hence, I think that the search of not only an economic pattern, but also of social model, one of the lessons of the crisis for Europe and for us is lying in the fact that we can speak about financial aspects, financial bubbles. The crisis emerges when there is disorganization and decoordination of the efforts of the society, of the efforts between finances and industry, between companies and the state, between different states. It cannot be resolved only due to one remedy, to one golden key. We want to look, and we need to look for the new holiness, because holiness is not in terms of totality. We had totalitarianism prior to market reforms, but that holiness has been dismantled. The Soviet Union was dismantled, but we have to find the new Union that will combine private and state interest of multiple regions of Russian Federation, and not only of Russia, but also of the world. Thank you.